Hi, everybody. We're live. You're watching the Jacquie Blaze Show. I, of course, am Jacquie Blaze. Joining me today is a very special guest. We're here to open up discussion about all things lockdown. You're going to hear Dr. Tim Sharp shortly, who's going to help us navigate through all of this because, Tim, love and fear are so closely interlinked. And, fear is doing as much damage as COVID is right now. What do you think about all of this?
Yeah. Oh, well, look, firstly, thanks for having me. Yeah, thanks for kickstarting what will hopefully be an interesting and useful conversation. Yeah, look, there's multiple layers to, I guess, to this to the COVID situation. There's very obviously a health issue, a medical issue, which is not necessarily my direct area of expertise, but I'm sure we'll touch on that. But there's also very obviously a psychological issue, and by that I mean that in response to or secondary to the health issues, there are, as I said, there's fear and anxiety, there's sadness and grief, there's loneliness. There's a whole range of psychological issues which have received quite a bit of attention, but maybe not as much as I, in my biased perspective, would like them to have received.
So let's point out for our audience at home, there are two main emotions, and everything falls under these two emotions, which is love and fear. So everything positive like happiness, joy, excitement falls under love. And then everything negative, such as anger, fear, sadness, falls under fear. And, it's so hard to stay happy and positive at the moment because we're tuning into the news and the media is constantly, and our government is constantly getting on and saying stay home, which is creating so much confusion because there are all these different rules. It's hard to keep up with them. It's hard to know which are the hotspots because we're all hotspot right now, especially down under in New South Wales and Sydney. It's just absolute craziness with protests going on. How do we help move people out of fear back to love?
Yeah, look, it is difficult, and I think that's the first thing that I would acknowledge. That we can't pretend that everything's fantastic when it's not. I think it's really important to accept that it's okay not to be okay. That for those of you out there that are feeling fear or anxiety or stress or sadness or whatever, that's a normal human emotion, a normal human response to what's going on. But obviously, we don't want to sort of dwell in there for too long. And the good news is there are things we can do. So once we've sort of accepted and acknowledged that it's okay not to be okay, that it's okay to feel anxious and sad, if we can then focus on doing whatever we can, and this will differ for different people, to boost our positivity, to boost our love, to enjoy as much as we can. And one of the things you mentioned the news earlier. One of the things I would say is, well, either turn off the news because that is pretty depressing, or I guess we do need to watch it to keep up to date with certain things. So be very conscious and mindful of how and what news you consume. I think it is easy to get sucked into an endless negativity, really, but and it's easy to forget then that there are lots of good things still happening. So make an effort to search out and focus on those good news stories, because there are still a lot of good people doing good things, and if we can make an effort to remind ourselves of that, that can be really helpful.
You're spot on because it's an absolute rabbit hole. I've got, epidemiologists and virologists coming on. So I've had to do research into vaccines, and there's so much, you could just keep going into this. And the more you look into it, there's evidence for both the vaccines. Um, you know, a case can be presented for and against by very reputable doctors. And what I found was that a lot of this stuff is being buried and called fake news. But it is a double-edged sword because we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. So there's evidence, and I know that you're not an expert at viruses and vaccines, but there's evidence showing that we can survive COVID. There's a 99% chance that we can without the vaccine. But then there's also evidence to say that what, the vaccine can protect us. The FDA only approved the vaccine 4 days ago. It did have an approval prior to that. It was an emergency approval, but it wasn't verified until 4 days ago. We still don't know of the implications of the vaccine. I mean, I'm not against vaccines. I've always had my vaccines. My daughter's had her vaccines. But as I was researching, it was so hard to stay positive because one of the things that I heard from the former vice president of Pfizer, who retired amicably, was that women can actually get brain clots and hormonal issues. And I actually happen to have a brain clot. So, and I'd been trying to get the Pfizer vaccine for months. There was no appointments because our government hadn't ordered enough vaccines. And now with that information coming out, I have to admit myself that it spiked a bit of fear in me because there's so much evidence out there. It's hard to ignore because a lot of mums and dads are sitting at home right now going, okay, well, am I going to vaccinate my child? Is the government going to make this a mandate? What do we tell these people? How do we handle all of this stress?
Well, look, again, I'll preface this by saying, as you said, look, I'm not an expert in that area. My expertise is in psychology, so I don't want to go into details. But what I would so I beg to differ from what you said earlier. I think the evidence is very, very clear. It's overwhelmingly in favour of vaccination and the safety of vaccination. There's absolutely no doubt, as far as I'm concerned, that the majority of experts are recommending that we should all get vaccinated as soon as possible. So again, it's not my area of expertise, but I do think that's important to state. What we need to do is be very careful and mindful of the credibility we give to some of those other stories, and I think that's probably all I'll say on that issue at the moment.
For me, it was I was on the same train of thinking as you until I started doing research for interviews for this show, because I had a doctor, an Australian doctor, on one of the shows request that we open discussion. So, as someone in media and as a journalist who works with love and relationships, and because love relates so closely to fear, I thought, it'd be helpful to have some of these experts on. And I found experts from Harvard, from Stanford, from Oxford, who have encouraged for our governments to do what's called focused risk assessments. There's a paper called the Great Barrington Declaration, which was written by 3 professors who are all credible, Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford professors. Those institutes are very recognizable. So there is that evidence on the internet that also shows that, they encourage governments to actually treat this pandemic through herd immunity without vaccines. They're not saying don't use the vaccines.
I have to jump here. I don't think that's true. I really don't think. And if that's what you want to talk about, I'm probably not the best person to talk to. But if you want to talk about some of the psychological issues, because I fundamentally
let's jump into that. Let's talk about gaslighting. Is there gaslighting happening by watching the news? And can you explain for our audience at home what gaslighting is?
Well, what maybe I ask, what do you mean by that term? Because it's used a lot in different contexts. So.
Well, with so much information, on the internet and all these conspiracy theories that are flying around, is it gaslighting people?
Well, look, I don't mean to be sort of argumentative, but I disagree with you. I don't think there's so much information around, and I don't think there's so much disagreement. I spent a lot of time, both personally and professionally, talking to people about this over the last year and a half. And again, my understanding is it's very clear and it's very simple. Vaccines are safe. Vaccines will protect you. If you listen to the experts,
not in relation to the vaccines. Dr. Sharp, in relation to just the negativity that's coming out, do you think that's gaslighting people? Can we explain to people what gaslighting is?
Oh, well, I do think, look, I do think that the news has been, I do think there's probably been an excessive amount of fear, which has generated anxiety. And I think I think that's an understandable, normal consequence of what's going on. It's hard to deal with such an issue without some level of fear and anxiety. But I do think, and look, I'm loath to criticize either the politicians or the media, because it is a very complex, difficult situation. So again, I don't mean to be overly critical, but I do think more could have been done to instill some confidence and hope. And I do think more could have been done to message more clearly earlier on. As I think you hinted at earlier, there has been confusion. The rules and regulations have changed, and that doesn't necessarily help. In fact, that can actually exacerbate some of the situation. So, there is cause for hope and optimism. There is a way out of this, and I do think we could all be doing more to highlight some of those positive paths forwards a bit better.
Absolutely. Well, what would you like to see changed out there? What do you encourage people to do?
With regards to what? Sorry.
Are we talking to the public right now, or are you talking about our government? What sort of things do you think could have changed? For example, I think we should reopen Kmart and David Jones. I mean, as stupid as that sounds, when we had Kmart and David Jones open, at least people had somewhere to go, and there wasn't any cases at those places. I'm guilty of wanting to go shopping for sure. I mean, being in this lockdown is, hard for all of us, including myself, but there wasn't any of those cases. So for me, the government has made things more difficult, because once things really went into lockdown to try to control everybody, that's when protests came out. That's when case numbers went from 150 and now we're at 900. So if that's not working, it's almost to me like telling a little kid, don't do that, they're going to do it. Whereas if there was some reverse psychology, if you kind of allowed some of it, it helps people be more contained. I feel like telling people not to get that they have to get the vaccine and encouraging them, although it could be a good thing, is perhaps contributing to some of that negative pushback and all that madness that we're seeing at the protests.
Well, again, I disagree with a few of the assumptions in there. I don't think the government's trying to control anyone. What the government's trying to do is save lives and keep people safe and healthy. I don't think the government's trying to tell us not to do things. I think what they're doing is doing the best under very difficult circumstances. And look, I'm not it's not that I'm a naive supporter of all politicians by any means, but I think what they're trying to do is do their best under very difficult circumstances to save as many lives as possible. Now, there is a very real challenge between managing the health aspects, keeping people safe, stopping people getting sick, and balancing that against economic consequences and psychological consequences. I mean, we know, for example, that although lockdowns and restrictions will limit the spread, they also contribute to some other problems like loneliness and like possibly some mental health issues. So that's a very tricky balancing act. And again, I think the government has tried to do the best they can. Whether they've got it 100% right or not, I don't know. Well, they probably haven't got it 100% right, because I don't think anyone would have got it 100% right. There's always a trade-off. So when you talk about opening up, there's obviously an argument for opening up from an economic point of view and even from a psychological point of view. But the question then becomes is how many lives are people prepared to sacrifice? How many people are we prepared to allow to get sick and then potentially die to save or to protect the economy? I don't know the answer to that. That's not my area of expertise. Again, that's a public health issue. That's a political issue. What I would argue, focus on from a psychological point of view, which is my area of expertise, is that what I think we all need to do is do the best we can within the context that we're living in. And the fact is, there are certain rules in place. I don't make those rules. You don't make those rules. There are restrictions, lockdowns in place. My perspective would be we need to accept them for what they are and do the best we can to be as healthy and happy and loving as we can within those restrictions until things change.
I love that you mentioned acceptance, because acceptance is a very big key to being able to change things in our own world, and that will inevitably have an effect on everybody. Let's talk about relationships. People are at home. They probably haven't spent this much time together since, their honeymoon, and they're having to deal with, kids at home, being homeschooled. There's so much stresses. How do we encourage couples to be able to work through relationship issues and not let the problems that are happening right now affect their relationship?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question, and I think that's been one of the major issues from a psychological perspective that we've experienced. Well, but two parts to that, I suppose. One is the stresses that it can put on intimate relationships. Husbands, wives, boyfriends, girlfriends, children, who are spending so much time together. But then the flip side of that is people who are on their own, and the exacerbated effects of loneliness, which we know is a major problem. But talking about the relationships, you're right. For many of us, it's very unusual to spend so much time for such a prolonged period just with our immediate family. There can be some good from that. I think if one thing that's come out, if there's been a silver lining to the last 18 months or so, based on the people that I've spoken to, is that it has led to many people appreciating their relationships, which is important. I think in the past, many of us might have taken them for granted. I think many of us know how important our loved ones are, our family and our friends and even our colleagues, even our work colleagues. So, and we know from the research that that's fundamentally important. I mean, I'm sure you know this, but from all of my work and all of my research over decades now in psychology, if I were to name the most important factor that contributes to health and well-being, to happiness, to longevity, it would almost certainly be the quality of our relationships.
Oh,
And that's
absolutely.
not just our intimate relationships, but all of our relationships, our connectedness, our sense of belonging. It is almost certainly the most important contributor to living a good life. So if that's put under strain, that can obviously be problematic. So to come back to your question, how do we deal with some of that? Well, again, I think it's important to accept that it is difficult. And so if you're maybe having a few arguments and maybe you're being a little bit more irritable, that's kind of a normal and appropriate and understandable side effect of what we're going through. But that being said, if we can also practice tolerance and patience and understand that these are unusual circumstances, so maybe we need to be a bit more accepting of our spouse's behavior or of our children's behavior or whatever, that can certainly be helpful, because we've got to live with this. As I said, we need to accept that this is how it is, and we'll probably need to live with it for a little bit longer. So one thing, I guess, one simple practical tip I said is to, if you're getting bogged down in the irritabilities or frustrations, try to practice a bit more appreciation. Try to focus as much as you can on the best bits of your partner or your children. That doesn't mean ignoring some of the frustrations. If you need to deal with them, be assertive and talk about them. But, I think many of us could benefit from practicing more appreciation and gratitude within our relationships and focusing more on what's going well.
Absolutely. I love that, because if we're grateful for what's going well, we're going to get more of that. And the same is true for the opposite. If we focus on what's not going right, we're going to get more of that. And I think we need to take responsibility for how we're all feeling within ourselves and do our best to kind of move from that space of fear to love. And we can do that best, I think, through self-care, whether you meditate, whether you exercise, or simply just having a bath. Sometimes it's just about switching off, because, we're so kind of drawn into this vortex right now of nonstop talking about, do I get the vaccine? Where do I have an appointment? When are we coming out of this lockdown? What's going to happen? How am I going to deal with my business, my kids, and so on? It's just hard to, always be getting into that positive step. I'm one of those people that I so appreciate having my partner. I have a wonderful partner. And, I encourage people to kind of take a step back, because all relationships, as I love that you actually pointed that out, are difficult and require a skill set. I'm very fortunate that, I specialize in love and relationships, because it's helped me know how to deal with all my relationships. What are some tools and strategies that people can adopt?
Yeah, well, I think you made a really important point, which is that all relationships have their challenges. And that's something we know from the research. And it's important to, it might sort of sound obvious, but it's important to remember sometimes that what we know from the research is that even the best relationships still have disagreements. Again, that might sound obvious, but even the best relationships argue sometimes. Even the best couples get frustrated and irritable. And again, at the risk of saying the obvious, it's important to remind ourselves of that sometimes, that that's just a normal part of spending a lot of time with another person. However, again, we don't want to get bogged down in that. We don't want to have too much of that. So what we know from the research is that there is kind of an ideal balance, an ideal ratio, the positivity ratio it's sometimes referred to, which is about 4 or 5 to 1. So what we know when we look at the best couples, John Gottman, who's a relationship expert, has done a lot of research in this over decades and decades. And what we know, when we look at the best couples and measure their interactions and look at the sort of quote unquote positive to the negative interactions, for every negative one, for every disagreement or argument or whatever it might be, there's about 4 or 5 positive ones. So what that means is 2 things. One, we need to accept the reality of those negative interactions, but we want to minimize them. And we also want to maximize the positive ones. So we actively want to create positive interactions. We actively want to show our love and appreciation for our partner. The other thing we want to do is that what we know when we look at the best couples is that when they do argue or disagree, which they do, is they make up much better. And this is the key. So it's the idea of arguing or getting frustrated isn't in and of itself a problem. It's what you do afterwards. Poor couples or dissatisfied couples tend to brew and fester and let things, boil away. Good couples or sort of healthy couples deal with it effectively. So they talk about it, they make up, they apologize, and they get over things much more quickly. So, there's something to keep in mind, I suppose. And I guess in very simple terms, it's kind of about perspective.
I love that. Doing the repair work is vitally important. And I always say, and I want to remind everyone at home, that life is not easier. Life is meant to challenge us because that's how we grow. So it's not about getting bogged down in those feelings, which I love. I love that you pointed that out because it can so easily happen to anybody. And right now we are seeing those calls to places like Lifeline, et cetera, going up. And if anyone at home is feeling heavy feelings, please don't be triggered by this. And if you've got nothing nice to say about what we're talking about, please don't say it at all because we're here to help you. There's so much around relationships that, we can take away from Dr. Sharp, who is actually, so well versed. I mean, Dr. John Gottman, for example, talks about, how we speak to our partner. If there's a tone of contempt, simply changing that tone and being more respectful towards our partner. Because as a woman, I'm guilty. I mean, every month, my partner has to deal with my emotions. And that's just something that he's learned to deal with, and he's brilliant. But I also know that I'm like, a little bit moody or stressed by work and have so many feelings that I could be feeling overwhelmed. So I make a conscious effort to speak to my partner in a kinder tone. What are the other things that, we can do right now to show kindness?
Yeah. Oh, look, you've hit on possibly one of my favorite topics, which is kindness. Something the world needs more of now.
Yes,
again, even when I guess when if we're talking about the vaccine issue, which again I don't want to get bogged down on, but clearly, there are different opinions. And I guess what we've seen a lot of in recent years, not just with vaccines, but in some political areas, is this sort of increasing disagreement and this increasing separation of different points of view. I'd love to think that we could disagree more kindly about all topics, because I think
disagree. I love that.
So, but I think, and so coming back to the point about relationships, I think that's really important. I mean, in any couple, clearly, I mean, and I've been married now for over 25 years. So, obviously spending that amount of time with a person for over such a long period, of course, there's going to be difference of opinion. Of course, it would be absurd to imagine that you're going to agree 100% of the time on 100% of the topics. In fact, that'd be boring. It'd be kind of weird in a way. But you're right. So if we can, again, kindness is just so fundamentally important and so fundamentally beneficial in so many different ways. And there's a few things we can do. Part of it comes down to empathy. Which is just sort of making an effort to understand the other person's perspective. Again, you don't necessarily have to agree, but if I can at least understand or try to understand that other person's perspective, then even if I disagree, I'll be able to do so from a more empathic, from a kinder, maybe a more compassionate point of view. And that takes effort, that takes time. And I suppose, again, this is a really important point as well, that, good quality relationships aren't always easy. They might be easier for some than others. And if you're in a loving relationship,
especially right now with a lot of people having lost their job. I mean, I want to share something with you that was a little bit disturbing to me. I hope that you at home will not find this disturbing, because it's not my intention to trigger anybody. But I was going to pick up some flowers from a florist that I don't normally go to because my florist has shut down during COVID. And it was the end of the day, it was 6 p.m. And he opened up to me about, how he's seen 5 suicides go to 12. And at that moment, it dawned on me that he would see this because, people need flowers for funerals. And he opened up to me that he had a personal experience. So I came back to my building and I was telling my concierge, and she said 3 in our building. So the numbers and the vulnerability and how people are, handling this, whether they're alone or in relationships, it has varied so much during lockdown because feelings are intensified. And, a lot of men apparently, are not dealing with consequences of losing their job and not being able to provide. So I think it's about understanding that our partner has their own demons that they could be going through during this lockdown period, and being more understanding and more supportive and loving, I think definitely will make a huge difference. Can you contribute to this, Dr. Sharp?
Well, yeah, for sure. And look, I guess what I'd say, look, regardless of COVID, regardless of lockdown, love and kindness and compassion and understanding are always, should always be prioritized. I think, these aren't necessarily new issues. We know that people who have struggled with mental health issues for a long time, they are probably, the research suggests that there are some slight increases in some areas, not necessarily quite as bad as we might have expected, which is kind of good news, but it's still, they're still at worryingly high levels. And again, I mean, regardless of the current circumstances and regardless of what's going on at the moment, you can never have too much love and kindness and compassion. And I think this is something that anyone that wants to go out there and wave the flag of love and kindness and compassion will get my support.
Absolutely. And I just want to remind everyone at home that you can actually give yourself love. So if you're alone, you can give it to yourself. And when you give it to yourself and treat yourself better, other people are going to treat you that way as well. And it always gets better. Tomorrow's a new day, there's a new beginning. It always gets better.
I'll add to that actually. Not just that you can, but you should. That it's important to. What psychologists more technically call self-compassion, which is a phrase you're probably familiar with, has been shown to be fundamentally and vitally important in so many different ways. And by self-compassion, what we mean is, in very simple terms, like treating yourself like you would treat a best friend. Often we're often much better at loving and being kind to others than we are to ourselves. But if we can give ourselves the same kindness and compassion and love, the way, say things to ourselves that we would say to our loved ones, that actually sets ourselves up for a much better life. We're much likely to be healthier and happier. And so we can then actually give more love to others.
I love that. That's so true because, we could, invite a friend over for dinner and organize this beautiful meal. But if it's just ourselves, we'll be, having that piece of toast with butter. I'm guilty. And it is about making that extra effort to be kind and also just to catch those thoughts that are running, in the background, kind of that doom and gloom that we may not even consciously be aware of. I know that, for me, I've actually got busier with work in lockdown. I thought, oh, fantastic, I can work from home, etc. But you kind of get caught in that whirlwind where things are just, you need to consciously separate work from home life. Otherwise, you end up working 24/7. So for me, it was really learning how to switch off. But, I think it's really important to kind of watch, that self-talk that we're giving ourselves and just to, speak kindly even to ourselves and definitely to other people around us. Dr. Tim Sharp, where can people find you? Tell us about the Happiness Institute.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. Probably if they want to go to the website, drhappy.com.au, so drhappy.com.au, or the Happiness Institute on Instagram. If they want to follow up and ask any questions, I'd be happy to chat further.
Thank you for coming on. And for those of you at home who are feeling triggered, please feel free to contact us and we will be more than happy to give you a copy of Love Unraveled, which is a complete skill set to love and relationships that I uncovered when I interviewed the world's top 4 love experts 14 years ago. It's helped me tremendously and I know it can help you. That's $97. We're willing to give it to you for free to anybody who wants to invest this time in helping themselves so that you can actually grow. I know that it'll make a great difference in anybody's life. So please feel free. And if you've liked this episode with Dr. Tim Sharp, please feel free to tag or share with a friend. And if you're feeling extra kind today, please head over to any of the platforms and give the Jacquie Blaze Show a review and a rating. 5 stars would be really appreciated. Thanks for watching. And Dr. Tim Sharp, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.